Amara Solis had learned, early and well, how to exist in more than one world at a time. It was not a skill she had sought. It was one she had developed the way people developed most survival skills, through necessity, through the slow accumulation of situations that required her to be one thing in one room and something slightly different in the next. She was good at reading spaces, good at adjusting without appearing to adjust, good at the kind of stillness that made other people feel comfortable while revealing very little of herself. She was 32 years old. She worked as an independent art consultant, authentication, private acquisitions, the kind of discreet service that moved between wealthy collectors and galleries without drawing public attention. It was in many ways the perfect profession for someone who had learned to move between worlds. Art was serious business wrapped in beauty. It required both precision and intuition. She was not a woman who sought power, but she had learned that power sought people who made it comfortable, and she had that quality in abundance. She had one apartment, 2 phones, a calendar she managed with the focus of an air traffic controller. She was not careless. She was never careless. But there were things that even the most careful people could not prevent, the way 2 separate lines, drawn long enough, eventually converge. She just didn't know yet that hers already had. She had met Luca Ferraro 3 years ago. Not under dramatic circumstances. There was no dramatic story of introduction, no charged first glance across a crowded room. She had been engaged to authenticate a piece for a private collector, and Luca had been at the collector's home for a different reason entirely. They had occupied the same room for an hour, spoken briefly about the painting in question, and parted. He had called her the following week about a separate acquisition. That was how it began. Luca Ferraro was 48 years old, Italian-born, and had operated in the city for 15 years with a quiet completeness that suggested deep roots. He was not in any business directory. He did not attend public events. He was known to the people who needed to know him and invisible to everyone else. He was controlled in the way of someone who had learned that control was survival. He spoke precisely. He listened more than he talked. He had a way of giving his full attention to whoever was in front of him that felt, when it was directed at you, like standing in a warm light. With Amara, the professional meetings became dinners. The dinners became something harder to categorize. He had never said anything explicit about what he felt. He didn't need to. She had understood from early on that Luca expressed everything through consistency. He showed up. He remembered. He was there. That, for him, was everything. Their relationship had a texture all its own. It was not loud. It was not theatrical. Luca did not buy her things to demonstrate his feelings. Or rather, he did occasionally, but the gifts were always specific and considered. A book she had mentioned once in passing, a small ceramic piece by an artist she admired, things that required listening. She cooked sometimes when she was at his house, a townhouse that was grand in its proportions, but lived in its feeling, the kind of space that suggested someone had built a life inside it rather than staging one. He watched her cook the way he watched most things she did, with the complete, undivided attention that still, even after 3 years, made her feel seen in a way she was not always comfortable with. They talked about art, about cities, about the kind of abstract things, memory, loyalty, the difference between discipline and rigidity that revealed more than either of them perhaps intended. She had not told him everything about herself. He had not told her everything about himself. They both understood that, and neither pressed. It was part of the balance they had found, a mutual willingness to be present without demanding complete transparency. It worked. It worked very well. She had believed, for most of those 3 years, that this was enough. She had believed it until the night she met Aid. His full name was Adebayo Ose. She met him at an auction preview, one of the large, invitation-only evenings that moved through the city's collecting circuit 4 times a year. She was there professionally. He was there for a piece she would later learn he had specifically tracked for 18 months. He was 43. Nigerian-born, London-educated, and had been in the city for 7 years. He moved differently than Luca. Where Luca was stillness, Adi was contained energy. He took up space in a room not through aggression, but through presence. People noticed him without being sure why. He had approached her about the piece he was watching. She had been standing near it, which he took as a sign of professional interest, and he was right. They had spoken for 20 minutes. He had known considerably more about the work than most buyers did, which she respected immediately. He had asked her opinion directly, which people rarely did at these events. She had given it honestly, which she rarely did either. By the end of the evening, he had her card, and by the following Thursday, he had used it. He was not like Luca. He was open where Luca was reserved, instinctive where Luca was deliberate. He laughed more easily. He disagreed with her sometimes directly, and enjoyed it when she disagreed back. She had not expected to find this interesting. She found it very interesting. She told herself in the beginning that it was professional. Ade had hired her legitimately. He had several pieces to acquire and needed guidance he couldn't get from the public market. She was the right person for the work. The time they spent together was justified, structured, appropriate. She told herself this for approximately 6 weeks. It stopped being true during a conversation at his apartment, a large, open space filled with books and art, and the kind of deliberate disorder that suggested a person who thought rather than performed. When they had been talking about a particular painter for 40 minutes, and she had realized mid-sentence that she was not thinking about the painting at all. She was thinking about the specific way he listened. He was quiet in that moment, and she finished her sentence, and he said something about the painter's use of negative space that was genuinely perceptive, and she sat with the realization for the rest of the evening and drove home with it, sitting in her lap like something she didn't know how to set down. She did not tell Luca. She did not tell Ade about Luca. She held both things separately and told herself this was temporary, a feeling that would resolve itself, settle, return to manageable. Feelings did that, usually. They flared, and then they found their level. This one did not find its level. She became, over the following months, exceptionally organized. This was her nature anyway. She was someone who managed complexity as a professional function, but she applied it now to the architecture of her personal life with a focus that she recognized, in her clearer moments, as its own kind of desperation. Luca was Tuesdays, Thursdays, and most weekends. He had a rhythm, and she fit into it cleanly. He did not ask about her other days in a way that required detailed accounting. He trusted her the way he trusted things he had decided to trust, completely and quietly. Ad was less predictable. His schedule moved with his interests. He was intensely focused when something absorbed him and loosely available when it didn't. She managed this by being the consistent one. She set the rhythm. He followed it without knowing he was following it. 2 phones, 2 calendars, 1 version of herself for each, which was not as different as she sometimes told herself. She was the same woman in both places, but calibrated, adjusted, presenting the angle each of them could hold. She was not lying. That was the thing she held on to. She was not saying things that weren't true. She was simply not saying everything. It was a distinction that had kept her steady for 4 months. She was beginning to feel the weight of maintaining it. Nobody knew. This was the part she returned to when the maintenance became exhausting, when she was driving between one world and the other, and the transition required a moment in the car, just sitting, just breathing, before she could go inside. Nobody knew. Her closest friend, a woman named Renee, who knew her better than most, had noticed she seemed busy. Amara had given her enough to satisfy. Busy professionally, a couple of private things, nothing to worry about. Renee had accepted this because Amara was genuinely a private person and had always been. Luca's world was insular. The people around him knew only what he shared, and he shared very little. She was known to his closest associate, a quiet man named Stefan, as someone Luca trusted. Stefan did not ask questions. Adid's world was somewhat more open, but not toward her specifically. He kept what mattered private. The people who moved around him saw her as a professional contact, nothing more. She had been careful about everything. No crossover of location, no overlapping social circles that she could identify, no digital trail connecting the two. She had planned for nearly every collision. What she had not fully planned for was the one that came from the inside. The way guilt built quietly. the way the careful management began to feel, not like discipline, but like a life she was building on foundations she didn't trust. Luca noticed something in October. It was small. He would not have been able to name it precisely. He was a man who dealt in patterns, who had built a career on the ability to sense when something in a familiar arrangement had shifted without being told. It was not suspicion in the accusatory sense. It was the professional instinct of someone who had survived by staying attuned. She had been at dinner with him on a Wednesday, an unusual night. She'd rearranged something, which was fine. He hadn't asked about it, and she'd been present in her body, but something in her attention had moved in and out of the room twice during the meal, in a way he'd noticed without commenting. She was distracted. She covered it well. But he had known her for 3 years, and the covering was slightly more visible than the distraction itself. He had said nothing. He watched instead. Over the following 2 weeks, he paid a different quality of attention than usual. Not surveillance. Observation, the quiet, patient kind that didn't announce itself. He noticed she checked her phone once at dinner in a way that was different from her usual checking. Faster. Slipped away from the table briefly. When she returned, she was composed. He was composed in return. They talked about other things, but something had been placed quietly in the back of his mind. It was a scarf. He found it one Sunday morning. She had stayed the night, which was not unusual, and was in the shower, and he was in the kitchen, and he noticed it on the chair by the door where she'd put her bag. It wasn't a scarf he'd seen before. That in itself was nothing. She had a great many things he didn't track. But this one caught him because it was distinctive, a specific pattern, a particular deep blue, the kind of piece that someone with her eye chose because it meant something aesthetically. He looked at it, looked away, made coffee. The scarf stayed in his mind. He had been to Adeose's office 2 months ago, a brief, indirect meeting through an intermediary about a property matter that had since resolved. He had not been inside the office, only in the building. But in the building's lobby, a woman had been leaving as he arrived. He hadn't looked at her specifically. He'd registered the coat, the locks, the scarf. The same scarf. He didn't move when the thought arrived. He poured the coffee with the same steady hand. He was not certain. He was not even close to certain. But he had the quality of attention now that he reserved for things that required it. He brought her the coffee when she emerged, smiled, said nothing. Aid felt it differently. Not a specific object or observation. He was less systematic than Luca, more instinctive. What he felt was a quality of absence that he couldn't locate. Amara was there when they were together. Fully present, engaged, the version of herself he had come to rely on. But there were edges to her availability that felt like more than scheduling. She was not always reachable. That was not unusual in itself. She was a busy person, and he respected that. But there were times when the unreachable quality had a specific density to it. When she said she was busy, something about how she said it was different from how she used to say it. He couldn't define this. He didn't try to. What he did was watch. He was a man who noticed people. It was one of his most consistent qualities, the attention he brought to understanding who someone actually was beneath what they presented. He had found, with Amara, someone who rewarded that attention. She was not a simple person. He liked that. But something was different. Not different in a way that alarmed him, yet. Different in the way a note sounds slightly off when the instrument needs tuning, barely to most ears, but not to his. He asked her, one evening, if everything was all right. She said yes, and smiled, and she was warm and present for the rest of the night. He believed her and didn't believe her simultaneously. November was the hardest month. She felt it accumulating, the specific weight of sustained concealment, which was different from the weight of a lie. A lie was a discrete thing. This was structural. It ran through everything, which meant everything cost more than it should have. She was tired in a way she couldn't explain to either of them without explaining everything. Luca called her one evening when she was leaving Ade's building. She was in the lobby, coat on, and his name appeared on the phone, and she stopped and waited until she was outside on the pavement before answering. 2 minutes that felt much longer. "Are you free Thursday evening?" he asked. "Yes," she said. Her voice was entirely normal. She hung up and stood on the pavement in the cold and looked at the street. She thought about what she was doing. She had thought about these many times. She was not someone who avoided thinking about difficult things. She was too self-aware for that, and she had too much respect for the truth as a category. She knew what she was doing. She understood its dimensions. What she had not yet resolved was what to do about it. Ending one thing, choosing, felt impossible in a way she couldn't fully rationalize. Both connections were real. Both mattered. She had not manufactured either of them, but she was running out of the particular kind of energy that impossible positions required. She walked to her car. The near collision happened on a Friday in December. She had arranged to meet Aid for lunch at a restaurant in the Gallery District, somewhere they'd been before, comfortable and quiet. She arrived first, which was usual, and was seated at a table near the back. She was looking at the menu when she heard a voice she knew. Not Luca. His associate, Stefan. Stefan was at the bar, speaking to someone she didn't recognize. He hadn't seen her. She was far enough back that the lighting and the arrangement of the room gave her some cover. She did not move. She assessed quickly. Stefan's back was half turned to her. The bar was 15 feet away. Aid was due in 8 minutes. She picked up her phone and sent Aid one message. Running late. Can we push to 1:15? Sorry, he replied in 2 minutes. Of course. She waited 4 minutes, the time she calculated it would take Stefan to finish and leave, watching without appearing to watch. He finished his conversation, picked up a takeaway order, and left through the front without looking back into the room. She let out a slow breath. She looked at her hands on the table. They were perfectly still. She was good under pressure. She had always been good under pressure. But she noticed for the first time that the pressure no longer felt like something she was managing. It felt like something that was managing her. Both men asked the same question that December. Not together. Not knowing the other had asked. Luca asked it at his kitchen table after dinner, quietly, in the way he did everything quietly. Is there something you haven't told me? Not accusatory, just direct. His eyes on her face with that particular quality of attention she'd always found both comforting and difficult to withstand. She said there was a lot she hadn't told him. They had both agreed early on that they held things and deflected with enough truth that it held. He didn't press. Aid asked differently. He asked while they were walking. They walked sometimes in the evenings when neither had somewhere to be, and he asked it sideways, which was his style. Do you ever feel like you're carrying something alone that you don't have to? She looked at the street ahead. Sometimes, she said. You can put things down, you know, he said. I'm not fragile. She almost told him. The impulse rose clearly and completely. She could feel exactly where the words would start, and she held it. I know, she said. He nodded. He didn't push either. She was surrounded by men who were good at giving her space to not say things. She was beginning to understand that this grace had a limit, that it was not infinite, that it depended on her eventually choosing to fill it. She made a decision in January, not to tell them, not yet, not all at once, but to stop. She had been building toward this conclusion for months, in the slow way that honest people arrived at hard choices, not through drama, but through exhaustion, through the accumulating recognition that what she was sustaining was not 2 relationships. It was one enormous act of management, and it was eating her alive. She had to choose. She spent 4 days with this. Not dramatic days, ordinary ones, work and routine and the business of living, but underneath everything ran the constant question. Luca or Ade? 3 years or 8 months? Stillness or energy? The man who had taught her what it felt like to be consistently chosen, or the man who had taught her what it felt like to be genuinely surprised? There was no clean answer. She was not sure there was a right one. What she knew was that she could not continue like this. It was not fair to either of them. It was barely fair to herself. She called Aid on a Thursday evening. She told him she needed to tell him something. She told him she had been seeing someone, had been, for longer than she should have, while she was also seeing him. She did not name Luca. She told the truth in the form that was hers to tell. Aid was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "How long?" She told him. 3 days later, the connection surfaced. Ade had been in a state she could only describe as contained devastation, the kind of response that didn't explode immediately but worked through its layers methodically, which was entirely consistent with who he was. He had not contacted her since the call. She had expected that and respected it. What she had not expected was what happened on Sunday. Ade had a meeting. She didn't know about it. She knew nothing of his professional arrangements, and he knew nothing of hers, which was part of how the separation had held for so long. The meeting was with Stefan. She did not know this until later, when Stefan told Luca, in passing, that he had met with Ade Ose about a logistics matter and that Ose had seemed distracted. Personally distracted, he said, not professionally. Luca had filed this as information. Luca had also, by this point, made his own quiet inquiries, not about Amara directly. He was too careful and too proud for that. But he had asked, in the peripheral way he asked everything, about certain patterns, about a name that had surfaced once or twice in a context he hadn't been able to place. Ade Ose. He had heard the name. And now Stefan was telling him Ose seemed personally distracted. Luca had sat with that information for 12 hours before the shape of it became impossible to ignore. She called Luca on Monday. She had been going to give herself another day, another week, the extra time that was always available when you needed to delay something difficult. But something in her had shifted after the call with Ade. Something that had been held very tightly had relaxed, slightly, and in the space it left, she found a clarity she hadn't had in months. She told him. She told him the same way she'd told Ade, the truth in the form that was hers to tell, without the other man's name, without the details that belonged to that other relationship. She told him she had been seeing someone else. She told him for how long. She told him she was sorry. Luca was quiet for the entire time she spoke. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough that she thought he might simply end the call. Then he said, "Is it Ade Ose?" She stopped. The silence this time was hers. "How?" she started. "Answer the question," he said. Still quiet, still precise, but something underneath it had changed, a temperature shift, barely perceptible, and all the more significant for that. "Yes," she said. He made no sound. "Luca, thank you for telling me," he said. The call ended. She sat holding the phone. She understood, from the quality of those words, that she had just heard the last thing Luca Ferraro would ever say to her that wasn't necessary. They found out about each other the following week. Not through her. She had told neither man the other's name, and she had held to that. But men in their world had ways of learning what they needed to learn, and the specific shape of the coincidence, two men, same woman, same window of time, was unusual enough to find its own way to the surface. Stefan was the mechanism, though he hadn't intended to be. A comment in a separate context that landed differently than it was meant to. A name mentioned in Luca's presence that registered because Luca's attention had been calibrated to it. They met, not at her instigation. She didn't know it was happening until it already had. A brief, private meeting, the kind her world handled through back channels rather than front doors. Two careful men in the same room with the same information. She imagined it, later, and could not quite build it in her mind. Two such controlled people confronting something that had nothing to do with control. What she knew of what happened came in pieces, from Ade, who told her directly, and from what she could read in the change in Luca, who told her nothing at all. They had spoken. They had not, apparently, destroyed each other. But something between them. Something that had existed in their professional world long before she entered either of their lives, had been broken in a way that professional matters alone could not have broken it. Ade came to see her. He sat across from her in her apartment, the first time he had been there, she realized, which produced a complicated feeling, and he looked at her with something she had not seen in him before. Not anger, something quieter and more final than anger. "Did you know," he asked, "that we knew each other?" "No," she said. "I didn't know until it was all ready." She stopped. "I didn't know." He nodded slowly. "I believe you," he said. "I want you to know that. I believe you didn't plan it." She looked at him. "Aid." "But it doesn't change what it was," he said. "What you were doing, what I was inside of, without knowing." He looked at his hands. "I'm not angry at you in the way I thought I would be. I've been thinking about that. Why I'm not more." He paused. I think because I understand that you were in something you couldn't see your way out of. I understand that feeling. I'm sorry, she said, plainly, without decoration. I know, he said. He stood. He looked at her one more time, the same quality of attention he had always brought, but different now, like someone memorizing something before leaving. I think you should figure out who you are when you're not managing something, he said. He left. She didn't follow him. Luca never came. He did not call. He did not send word through Stefan. He simply withdrew. Completely and finally, the way he did everything. The Tuesday dinners stopped without announcement. The Thursday calls ceased. The quiet consistency that had been the defining characteristic of 3 years became, in its absence, the loudest thing she had ever heard. She understood this was his answer, his kind of answer, not a confrontation, not an expression of pain. An ending, made real through the absolute removal of presence. It hurt more than she had expected, because she had known him long enough to know what his consistency had cost him. He was not a man who gave that easily. She had known that, and she had been careless with it, even while believing she wasn't. She sat with both absences. Adade's, which had the quality of a door closed regretfully but firmly. Luca's, which had the quality of a wall. She had lost them both in the same week. What she had not expected was that the grief was not only for them. It was for who she had been in that period, the version of herself who had decided that managing was the same as living, who had confused complexity for depth, who had been so afraid of choosing that she had let the choice be made by circumstance. She sat with this for a long time, not running from it, for the first time in a long time, just sitting. Nothing returned to how it was. She had known it wouldn't. She was too clear-eyed for false hope, too self-aware for the comfort of pretending. What she had set in motion had run to its conclusion, and the conclusion was real and permanent, and she owed it to herself and to both of them to face it as such. She threw herself into work. Not as escape, she had enough insight to know the difference, but as the honest use of the self she had remaining. The art world received her full attention for the first time in 2 years, and she was surprised to find how much she had been only half present in it. Renee made her talk. They sat in Renee's kitchen for an entire afternoon, and Amara said out loud the things she had been not saying for 2 years, and it was both worse and better than she expected. Worse because hearing it made it real. Better because real things could be worked with. She heard from Adid once, 6 months later, a brief professional message about a piece he was considering. She gave him an honest assessment. He thanked her. They left it there. She heard nothing from Luca. She did not expect to. What she learned, slowly, not in the dramatic way of revelations, but in the steady way of honest living, was that she was a person who needed to exist in one place at a time. Not because she wasn't capable of complexity, but because the people who deserved her deserved all of her, and so did she.